He bought the last woman left behind, and what happened next will shock you to your very core. The wind was the only constant companion Elias had known for a decade. It was a sculptor, carving his face into a mask of stoic resolve, etching lines around his eyes that spoke not of laughter, but of long years spent squinting at a merciless sun and an unforgiving horizon. His world was 160 acres of rock, dust, and stubborn pine, a harsh kingdom he ruled with the silent competence of a man who had left all other kingdoms behind. The cabin was small, built by his own 2 hands, each log a testament to his will to endure. It stood against the elements like he did, solitary and unyielding. His days were a ritual of survival, a series of deliberate, practiced motions that left no room for wasted energy or stray thoughts. He chopped wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe a steady heartbeat in the vast silence. He checked his traps, his movements economical and sure. He mended fences that held nothing in, but were a declaration of order against the encroaching chaos of the wilderness. He was a man whittled down to his essential self, his past a ghost he never spoke of, a weight he carried in the set of his shoulders, and the rare, somber moments when his gaze would linger on the setting sun, a flicker of some old pain surfacing before being ruthlessly suppressed. His hands, calloused and scarred, were his primary language. They could soothe a spooked horse, set a dislocated bone, and hold a rifle with unwavering steadiness. They spoke of a life lived through action, not words. The few traders who passed through twice a year knew him only as a quiet man who paid in pelts and never haggled. They saw a ghost of the frontier, a relic from an older, harder time. They did not see the man who had once commanded others, who had known loss so profound it had scoured him clean of all, but a deep, unshakable code. He was a protector by nature, though he had nothing left to protect but his own solitude. That solitude was a fortress he had built around the ruins of his heart, and he guarded its walls with a vigilance born of bitter experience. The horse came out of the east, a dark smudge against the dawn, moving too fast for a casual rider. Elias saw it from the crest of the ridge where he'd been checking a snare line. He didn't reach for the rifle propped against a nearby pine. His posture simply changed. The easy stillness of the hunter was replaced by the rigid readiness of the soldier. The rider was heavy in the saddle, pushing the animal hard, a sign of urgency or arrogance. As the man drew closer, Elias recognized him. Marcus Thorne, a rancher from the next valley over, a man whose wealth was as vast as his reputation for cruelty. Thorne reined in his lathered stallion 50 yards from the cabin, his eyes sweeping the property with the acquisitive glare of a man used to owning everything he saw. He was flanked by 2 hired men, their hands resting on the butts of their pistols. They were not here for a social call. Elias descended the ridge with a slow, deliberate pace, his own rifle now held loosely in the crook of his arm. He stopped by his porch, a silent sentinel on his own land. "Thorne," he said. The name was a flat statement, not a greeting. Thorne spat a wad of tobacco near Elias's boots. "I'm looking for something that belongs to me." He paused, letting the insult hang in the air. "My daughter, Elara, slipped her leash this morning. You seen a girl, about 18, dark hair? Got a fiery temper." Elias's face remained impassive. He had heard whispers about Thorne's daughter, a girl kept like a prized mare, beautiful and broken. "Haven't seen anyone," Elias said. His voice was gravelly from disuse. Thorne's eyes narrowed, searching Elias's face for a lie. "There's a reward. $100 in silver for her return. No questions asked." The offer was a test, a lure. Elias just stared back, his silence more of an answer than any denial. Thorne grunted in frustration. "If you see her, you know where to find me. She's to be married to Silas Croft. He's a man who doesn't like his property going missing." With a sharp tug on the reins, Thorne wheeled his horse around and galloped away, his men following in his dusty wake. Elias watched them go, his gaze cold. He knew of Silas Croft, a man whose cruelty was a match for thorns. Long after they were gone, he remained still, scanning the horizon. The offer of silver meant nothing. The mention of Croft meant everything. It confirmed this was not a family squabble. It was a rescue. He turned and went about his chores, but his senses were now on high alert. The wind had brought him a problem, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that the problem was already here. That evening, as he brought in the last of the firewood, a sound from the barn made him freeze. It wasn't a horse or a rat. It was the soft, terrified sob of a human being. He set the wood down without a sound and walked toward the barn, his hand not on his rifle, but held open, a gesture of peace to a cornered animal. He pushed the heavy barn door open, the old wood groaning in protest. The last rays of the setting sun sliced through the dusty air, illuminating a small figure huddled in the hayloft. She was barely more than a girl, her dark hair tangled with bits of straw, her dress torn at the shoulder. Her face was smudged with dirt and tears, but her eyes, wide and frightened, held a spark of defiant pride. It was Elara Thorne. She flinched as he stepped inside, scrambling backward until her back was pressed against the rough-hewn wall. She looked like a trapped fawn, ready to bolt or fight, her body trembling, but her chin held high. Elias stopped just inside the doorway, letting his eyes adjust, letting her see that he meant no harm. He didn't speak. Words would only frighten her more. He simply stood there, a bulwark of calm in her storm of fear. His presence was large and imposing, yet his stillness was reassuring. He was not like her father or the men her father hired. There was no aggression in his stance, no avarice in his eyes. After a long moment that stretched into a small eternity, he turned his back on her. It was an act of profound trust, a deliberate display of vulnerability. He walked over to a water barrel, ladled some fresh water into a tin cup, and placed it on an overturned crate near the base of the ladder to the loft. Then he went back to the cabin. He left the barn door slightly ajar, an invitation and an escape route. Inside his own small home, he stoked the fire in the hearth and added more rabbit and root vegetables to the stew simmering in the cast-iron pot. He worked with the same methodical grace he applied to all his tasks, his movements quiet and efficient. An hour passed. The sky outside deepened to an inky black, and the cabin was a small bubble of warm, orange light in the vast darkness. He ate his stew alone at the rough-hewn table, his ears tuned to the sounds of the night. Then he heard it, the soft creak of the cabin door. She stood on the threshold, a silhouette against the star-dusted night. She was still wary, her body tense, but the gnawing hunger and cold had clearly won out over her fear. He didn't look at her directly. He just gestured with his spoon toward the pot on the hearth. It was another invitation, another piece of the nonverbal language of safety he was building for her. She hesitated, then slowly, cautiously, she stepped inside, closing the door softly behind her. He ladled a generous portion of stew into his only other bowl and set it on the far side of the table, along with a piece of hard bread. He then resumed his own meal, giving her the space and privacy to eat without feeling watched. She ate with a desperate, silent hunger, her eyes darting around the small, one-room cabin. It was a Spartan place, clean and orderly. A single bedroll in the corner, a shelf with a few worn books, a rack holding a well-cared-for rifle and a holstered pistol. It was the home of a man who possessed little, but took great care of what he had. There were no feminine touches, no signs of another life. It was a place of solitude, and now she was an intrusion upon it. When she was finished, she placed the empty bowl on the table, her eyes finally meeting his across the flickering firelight. Her lips parted as if to speak, to offer thanks or an explanation, but she couldn't find the words. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was enough. It said, "You are safe here." He stood, took his bedroll from the corner, and laid it out on the floor in front of the door. He checked the simple wooden bar that secured it, and lay down, his back to her, his gun belt within easy reach. He was her guardian, her jailer, and her shield, all at once. For the first time in days, Elara felt a sliver of security. She was in the den of a wolf, but she knew, with an instinct she couldn't explain, that this wolf would not harm her. He would stand between her and the other, more vicious predators that hunted her in the night. The next morning broke cold and clear. Elias was up before the sun, moving with the quiet efficiency of a man long accustomed to solitude. He started the fire, put a pot of bitter coffee on to boil, and stepped outside into the pre-dawn chill. The world was washed in shades of gray and deep blue. He did not check on the girl. He gave her the dignity of waking on her own terms. When he came back inside with an armload of wood, she was awake, sitting on the stool by the cold hearth, a coarse blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Her eyes followed his every move, watchful and calculating. She was no longer just a frightened child. She was a survivor, assessing a new and unpredictable element in her environment. He poured 2 cups of coffee, placing one on the table for her without a word. She accepted it with a quiet nod. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was functional, a space where trust could either grow or wither. After they had drunk their coffee, the sound of hoofbeats returned, distant but drawing nearer. Elias's body went still. He glanced at Elara, saw the fresh wave of panic in her eyes, and gave a sharp, downward jerk of his head toward the small root cellar door hidden beneath a bearskin rug. She disappeared without a sound, pulling the rug back into place. Elias picked up his rifle, checked the load, and stepped out onto the porch, leaning against a post as if he had been there all morning. It was Thorn and another man. This one was different from the hired guns. He was dressed in finer clothes that were ill-suited for the rugged terrain. A soft-bellied man with a cruel twist to his mouth and eyes that roamed over Elias's property with an air of entitled disdain. This had to be Silas Croft. Still no sign of her hermit? Croft's voice was a sneer. Elias's eyes remained fixed on the horizon, not deigning to look at him directly. "Told your man yesterday. Saw a girl matching the description. Heading north, towards the mountains. She'd have a full day's lead on you by now." He delivered the lie with the same flat, emotionless tone he used for the truth. Thorne studied him, his suspicion a palpable force. North? Why would she go north? There's nothing up there but wolves and winter. Maybe she prefers the company, Elias said, the words carrying a subtle sting. Croft dismounted, his expensive boots crunching on the gravel. He took a step toward the porch, his hand resting on a silver-inlaid pistol. "A man living all alone out here, ... it gets lonely. You find a pretty little thing wandering on your land, you might be tempted to keep her. $100 is a lot of money, but a warm body through a long winter, that might be worth more." The insinuation was vile, and a muscle feathered in Elias's jaw. He slowly turned his head, and for the first time he looked directly at Silas Croft. His eyes were like chips of gray granite, cold and hard and utterly devoid of fear. "You are not welcome on this land," Elias said, his voice low and dangerous. "Your business is not my business. Ride on." There was a moment of tense silence where the world seemed to hold its breath. Croft was not used to being spoken to this way. He was a predator, but he was facing something he didn't understand, a man who had nothing to lose and who radiated a quiet lethality that Croft, as hired muscle, could not match. Thorne, ever the pragmatist, put a hand on Croft's shoulder. "He's not worth the trouble, Silas. If she went north, we're wasting time here." Croft hesitated, then allowed himself to be pulled back toward his horse, his eyes still locked on Elias, promising retribution. They mounted up and rode away, their threats and dust fouling the clean morning air. Elias waited until they were a distant speck before he turned and went back inside. He lifted the rug. Elara emerged from the darkness, her face pale. She looked at him, her defenses finally beginning to crumble. "He won't stop," she whispered, her voice trembling. "My father sold me to him, to clear a gambling debt. Silas, he likes to hurt things." She didn't need to elaborate. Elias had seen men like Croft before, bullies who cloaked their sadism in wealth and power. He looked at the girl, at the defiance still burning in her eyes, despite her terror, and he understood. This was no longer just about offering shelter for a night. He had lied for her. He had faced down her tormentors. He had, without intention or declaration, chosen a side. He picked up his axe from beside the door. "The woodpile is low," he said, his voice returning to its usual gruff monotone. The message was clear. We will face what comes, but first there is work to be done. Life must go on. The days that followed fell into a new rhythm, a silent partnership forged in the crucible of shared threat. The immediate danger had passed, but its shadow lingered, lending a quiet urgency to their daily tasks. Elias did not ask Elara to work, nor did he instruct her. He simply went about his life, and she, with the sharp instincts of someone who has always had to earn their keep, found her place within it. She started with the small things. She found his meager mending kit, a rusty needle, and some coarse thread, and began repairing the tears in his worn-out shirts. Her stitches were small and neat, a stark contrast to his own clumsy patch jobs. He noticed the next morning when he put on a shirt and the familiar tear at the elbow was gone, replaced by a row of her careful handiwork. He said nothing, but he left a second cup of coffee on the table for her again. It was their new morning ritual, an unspoken acknowledgement of her presence, of her contribution. Soon she moved from mending to the cabin itself. While he was out checking his trap lines, she would sweep the rough plank floor, scrub the single pot until it shone, and organize his few belongings with a quiet efficiency. She was bringing a subtle sense of order and life to a place that had only ever known the stark functionality of a solitary man. One afternoon, he returned to find she had discovered the small, fallow patch of earth behind the cabin where he'd once tried to grow vegetables. She had found his rusty spade and was turning the soil, her brow furrowed in concentration. He stood for a moment, watching her. She was not a fragile doll. She was wiry and strong, her movements determined. He walked to the shed, retrieved a bag of potato seeds he'd been saving, and set it down on the ground beside her patch of earth. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with surprise. He just nodded toward the bag. "They'll need to be in the ground before the first frost," he said. It was the most he had said to her at one time since her arrival. Her face broke into the first genuine smile he had ever seen from her, a brilliant, startling thing that momentarily chased the shadows from her eyes. She had been given a task, a purpose. She was no longer just a refugee. She was a partner in this small, defiant act of living. He began to teach her other things, always through action rather than words. He took her to the stream and showed her how to spot the deep pools where the trout hid. He didn't hand her the fishing line. He just left it on the bank and let her learn by watching him. When she caught her first fish, a small silver creature that writhed in her hands, her cry of triumph echoed in the quiet valley. That evening, as they cooked it over the fire, the shared meal felt different. It wasn't just sustenance. It was a harvest, a product of their combined effort. The most significant lesson came a week after her arrival. He took his spare rifle down from the wall, a slightly smaller, lighter model. He led her out to a clearing and set up a tin can on a stump 100 yards away. He handed her the rifle. It was heavy in her arms, and she held it awkwardly. He stepped behind her, the first time they had been in such close proximity. He didn't touch her, but she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. His voice was low and calm in her ear. "Breathe out. Squeeze, don't pull." He guided her stance with a few gruff words, adjusting her elbow, showing her how to sight down the barrel. He was teaching her to defend herself. He was giving her power. Her first few shots went wide, the kick of the rifle startling her, but she was determined. She set her jaw, listened to his quiet corrections, and focused. Her last shot of the day rang out, and the tin can flew off the stump. A slow, proud smile spread across her face. He simply nodded, his own expression unreadable, but for a glint of approval in his eyes. He was arming her not just against Thorn and Croft, but against the world. He was teaching her that she was not helpless. As they walked back to the cabin in the fading light, a comfortable silence settled between them. They were no longer a man and a runaway girl. They were two solitary people who, through the simple acts of mending and planting and learning, were beginning to mend each other, planting the seeds of a trust that was taking root in the hard, unforgiving soil of their lives. The uneasy peace was shattered 2 weeks later. The air had turned colder, a harbinger of the coming winter, and a sense of foreboding had settled over the small homestead. Elias felt it in his bones, a familiar prickle of instinct that had kept him alive in places far more dangerous than this. He began spending more time on the ridge, his eyes constantly scanning the eastern trail. He reinforced the bar on the door and kept a pistol tucked into his belt even while doing chores. Elara saw the change in him and mirrored it. Her quiet industry now had a nervous edge, and she rarely strayed far from the cabin, her gaze often drifting toward the same trail he watched. They were a garrison of two, waiting for a siege. It came on a gray, overcast afternoon. Elias was splitting the last of a large pine log when he heard the horses. It wasn't the frantic gallop of last time. This was a slow, deliberate approach. The sound of many horses, walking, not running, and occupying force. He straightened up, axe in hand, and saw them crest the hill. Thorn and Croft were at the front, but this time they had brought 6 men with them, a small army of hard-faced riders armed with rifles. They fanned out, surrounding the cabin in a loose, menacing semicircle. There would be no easy denial this time. They had come for a confrontation. He gave a low whistle, a prearranged signal. Inside the cabin, Elara slammed the bar across the door and moved to the small window, the rifle he had taught her to use held tightly in her hands. Elias didn't run for the cabin. He stood his ground by the woodpile, the heavy splitting axe held loosely in one hand. It was a tool, not a weapon, but in his grip it looked deadly enough. "Thorn," Elias called out, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "You've brought a lot of men to look for a lost girl." Thorn smirked, a cruel, confident expression. "We're not looking this time, hermit. We know she's here. My daughter is my property. Croft here is paid for her. We're just here to collect what's ours." Silas Croft spurred his horse forward, his face a mask of smug victory. "We can do this easy, or we can do this hard. The choice is yours. Give us the girl, and we'll ride out. We might even let you keep your miserable life." Elias's eyes were fixed on Croft, his expression unreadable. He was calculating odds, positions, threats. 8 men, all armed. He had a rifle in the cabin, a pistol on his hip, and an axe in his hand. The odds were not good, but retreat was not in his nature. He had drawn a line in the dust around this girl, and he would not back down. It was then that the cabin door creaked open behind him. He turned his head slightly, a flicker of anger in his eyes. He had told her to stay inside, to stay safe. But Elara was no longer the frightened girl who had hidden in his hayloft. She stepped out onto the porch, her face pale but resolute. The rifle was in her hands, and she held it not with the awkwardness of a novice, but with the steady purpose of a soldier. She was not hiding. She was making her stand with him. Her appearance changed the dynamic entirely. Croft's eyes lit up with a possessive, predatory gleam. There she is, as pretty as I remembered. Come on now, Elara. Stop this foolishness and come to your husband. The word husband was a vile poison. Elara's knuckles whitened on the stock of the rifle. She looked not at Croft, but at Elias. Her eyes were pleading, desperate. They were trapped. They were outmanned and outgunned. A bloody battle seemed inevitable. But in that moment of desperation, a wild, reckless idea sparked in her mind. It was a gamble, a desperate play to change the rules of the game entirely. She walked down the porch steps and stood beside Elias, so close he could feel the tremor running through her body. She looked up at him, her voice a low, urgent whisper that only he could hear. "I've never been kissed," she said, her words a startling, nonsensical confession in the face of death. He stared down at her, confused. Her eyes were burning with a fierce, desperate intelligence. "Do it," she hissed, her gaze flicking toward the men and then back to him. "Now, before my father walks in here and takes me." She wasn't asking for romance. She was asking for a shield. She was asking him to make a claim so public, so definitive, that it would shatter her father's claim of ownership. It was a desperate, mad strategy, born of a survivor's will to live on her own terms. Elias processed her words in an instant. He saw the brilliant, desperate logic behind her plea. It was not a request for affection. It was a weapon. A social declaration more powerful than a bullet in this moment. To kiss her would be to claim her in the eyes of these men, to transform her from Thorne's runaway property into his chosen woman. It would change the nature of the conflict from a retrieval to a dispute between two men over one woman, a matter of honor, however twisted. But a kiss was not his way. His language was action, not sentiment. He looked into her terrified, determined eyes and understood he had to answer her plea in his own language. He didn't lean down to kiss her. Instead, he did something far more profound. He took the splitting axe from his right hand and passed it to his left. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion that drew the eyes of every man watching, he reached out and took her hand. His calloused, scarred fingers wrapped around hers, a firm, possessive, and deeply protective gesture. He drew her to stand slightly behind him, placing his body squarely between her and the 8 armed men. It was a simple act, but it was an unmistakable statement. It said, "She is with me. To get to her, you must go through me." Then he raised his voice, not shouting, but pitching it to a low, resonant timbre that cut through the tension. "Her name is Elara," he said, looking directly at Thorne. "And she is not your property. She is a free woman, and she has made her choice to stay." The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. He had not only refused their demand, he had thrown the ultimate insult back in their faces. He had given their chattel a name, a will, and a choice. He had declared her a human being. Silas Croft's smug expression curdled into a mask of pure fury. The public humiliation was more than he could bear. "You bastard," he snarled, his hand flying to his pistol. "She belongs to me." He spurred his horse forward, intending to ride Elias down and snatch Elara from behind him. But he had fundamentally misjudged the man he was facing. Elias was not a simple hermit. He was a predator of a different kind, one who had been dormant for years. As Croft's horse charged, Elias moved with a liquid speed that was terrifying to behold. He released Elara's hand, shoved her back toward the safety of the porch, and drew the long-barreled pistol from his belt in a single fluid motion. He didn't aim for Croft. He aimed for the horse. The gunshot was a deafening crack in the silence. The horse screamed, a terrible, high-pitched sound as it crumpled to the ground with a broken leg. Croft was thrown clear, landing hard in the dust, his fine clothes ruined, his dignity shattered. Before any of the other men could react, Elias was moving again. He closed the distance to the downed and dazed Croft in 3 long strides. He kicked the pistol from Croft's hand, sending it spinning into the dirt. He grabbed the front of Croft's shirt, hauled him to his feet, and pressed the still-warm barrel of his own pistol under the man's soft chin. The entire sequence had taken less than 5 seconds. The other riders sat frozen on their horses, their rifles half raised, unsure of what to do. They had come for an easy intimidation, not a professional execution. Elias's eyes, cold as a winter grave, scanned the remaining men. "Anyone else?" he asked, his voice calm, almost conversational. No one moved. No one spoke. They saw him now for what he was. Not a victim, but a veteran. A man who knew violence intimately. Thorn stared, his face a mixture of shock and a dawning, grudging respect. He had brought a gang to a gunfight, only to find the other side was a one-man army. The balance of power had irrevocably shifted. The standoff was not over, but the first battle had been won, not with a kiss, but with a cold, brutal, and decisive display of will. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and the acrid scent of fear. Silas Croft trembled in Elias's grip, the hard steel of the pistol barrel pressing into the soft flesh beneath his jaw. His arrogance had evaporated, replaced by the stark, primal terror of a man facing his own mortality. He was a bully who had just discovered his victim was a sleeping bear. Elias's gaze never left the other men, his thumb resting on the hammer of his pistol. He was a statue of deadly intent, his focus absolute. He had created a stalemate, but it was a fragile one. The first man to lose his nerve could turn this into a bloodbath. "Thorn," Elias said, his voice a low growl. "Call off your dogs." Thorn, for the first time, looked uncertain. His plan had disintegrated. His intended son-in-law was a hostage, and his hired muscle was clearly unwilling to test the quiet man who held him. He looked from Elias to his daughter, who now stood on the porch, rifle raised and aimed squarely at her father's chest. Her hands were steady. Her eyes were hard. This was not the girl he had tried to break. This was a woman forged in the fire of defiance, and he did not recognize her. The sight of her, resolute and ready to kill for her freedom, seemed to be the final blow. He had lost her, not just to this strange hermit, but to herself. His authority was a ghost. His control was an illusion. He had come to collect property and had instead been shown the folly of his entire life. With a slow, tired gesture, Thorn raised his hand. "Stand down," he ordered his men. They lowered their rifles with visible relief. The tension broke, replaced by a sullen, defeated silence. Elias didn't relax his grip on Croft. He waited. "It's over," Thorn said, his voice rough with emotion. Whether it was anger, shame, or regret, it was impossible to tell. "Let him go. We'll leave." Elias held Croft for a moment longer, letting the lesson sink in. He wanted the man to remember this feeling, this utter helplessness. Then, with a shove, he threw Croft to the ground. Silas scrambled away on his hands and knees like a panicked crab, grabbing his own pistol before retreating behind Thorn's horse, his eyes full of hatred and humiliation. Elias holstered his pistol, but did not take his eyes off the men. Thorn looked at his daughter one last time. "Elara," he said, the name sounding foreign on his lips. She did not answer. She just kept the rifle trained on him. There was nothing left to say. With a final, disgusted look at the entire scene, his whimpering suitor, his defiant daughter, the unmovable man who had shattered his world, Thorn turned his horse. "Let's go," he growled. One by one, the riders followed, a somber, defeated procession. They helped the limping Croft onto a horse and rode away, leaving behind only dust and the dying sound of hoofbeats. The wounded horse lay on the ground, its breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. The siege was over. The immediate threat was gone. Elias and Elara were left alone in the sudden, ringing silence. The adrenaline began to recede, leaving a hollow, trembling exhaustion in its wake. Elias walked over to the injured horse. His face was grim. He drew his pistol again, his movements weary. He looked at the animal's pain-filled eyes, and a flicker of something pity, sorrow crossed his face. He fired one last shot, a clean, merciful end to the suffering. The final gunshot echoed across the valley, a full stop to the day's violent chapter. He stood over the dead animal for a long moment, the smoke curling from his pistol, his shoulders slumped. Elara slowly lowered her rifle. She walked down the steps and approached him cautiously. She stopped a few feet away, her eyes tracing the lines of exhaustion on his face. He had stood against an army for her. He had faced death for her. He had killed for her, if only a horse. The space between them was charged with everything that had not been said, with the violence they had just shared, and with the terrifying, unspoken question of what came next. Silence descended upon the homestead, deeper and more profound than any that had come before. It was not the peaceful silence of solitude, but the heavy, ringing quiet that follows a storm. The body of the dead horse was a stark, gruesome monument to the day's violence. The air still tasted of gunpowder. Elias methodically reloaded his pistol, the familiar clicks of the cylinder turning being the only sound. His hands were steady, but his mind was a maelstrom. For the first time in 10 years, he had let the world in. He had broken his own cardinal rule: do not get involved. He glanced at Elara. She was staring at the dead horse, her expression a mixture of shock and a strange, hard-won peace. The terror had been exorcised by violence, and in its place was a weary calm. "We need to deal with that," he said, his voice flat, gesturing with his chin toward the animal. "Can't leave it to rot." It was a practical matter, a return to the necessities of survival. It was something to do, a way to move forward from the precipice they had just stood upon. He fetched a harness and ropes from the barn, and together, in a grim, wordless partnership, they dragged the heavy carcass to a deep ravine a quarter-mile from the cabin. The work was hard and gruesome, but it was necessary. It was a cleansing ritual, a way of burying the ugliness of the day. By the time they were done, dusk was falling, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange. They walked back to the cabin side by side, not touching, but acutely aware of each other's presence. The space between them had changed. The invisible wall of his solitude and her fear had been torn down, and they were left standing in the rubble, two strangers bound by a shared trauma. Inside, the cabin felt different. It was no longer just his sanctuary. It was their fortress, the place they had defended together. Elara lit the lamp, while Elias started a fire in the hearth. The simple domestic acts felt momentous, a re-establishment of peace and order. She took a cloth and began to wipe down the rifle she had held, her movements precise and careful. He watched her for a moment. He saw the way she handled the weapon, with respect and familiarity. She was not the same person he had found hiding in his barn. She had faced down her father, faced down her own fear, and had not flinched. He noticed a dark stain on his sleeve and realized it was blood from where he grabbed Croft. He went to the water basin to wash it off, and as he scrubbed his hands, he saw his own reflection in the small, cracked piece of mirror he kept on the wall. The face looking back was the same, but the eyes were different. The cold, empty stillness was gone, replaced by a flicker of something else, something he hadn't felt in a very long time. A fierce, protective purpose. He was no longer just surviving. He was defending. He turned back to the room. Elara had finished with the rifle and was now tending to a small cut on her hand, a scrape she must have gotten during the chaos. He walked over, took a tin of salve from a shelf, and held it out to her. She looked up, surprised. She took the tin, her fingers brushing his. The brief contact sent a jolt through both of them, an acknowledgement of the new intimacy that had been forged between them. "Thank you," she whispered. It was the first time she had said the words. "You didn't have to do any of this." He just grunted in response, turning back to the fire, but her words hung in the air. He knew she was right. He didn't have to. He could have turned her away. He could have taken the silver. He could have stayed in his fortress of solitude. But he hadn't. Some old, buried part of his soul, the part that believed in honor and justice, the part he thought had died long ago, had risen up, and it had risen up for her. The threat from Thorne and Croft might be gone for now, but they both knew it wasn't a permanent solution. Men like that held grudges. They would be back, perhaps not tomorrow, but someday. The future was a vast, uncertain territory. But as they sat in the quiet, firelit cabin, a silent understanding passed between them. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The morning after the confrontation dawned with a fragile beauty, as if the world was trying to apologize for the ugliness of the day before. The air was crisp and clean, and the sun rose over the mountains, casting long, peaceful shadows across the valley. Elias rose at his usual hour, but his routine felt different. The solitude he had once cultivated as a shield now felt like a hollow echo. He built the fire and made the coffee, but he found himself waiting for the sound of Elara stirring. When she emerged from the corner where she slept, her eyes were clear. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet strength. She met his gaze directly, without the wariness that had been her constant companion. They drank their coffee in their customary silence, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was comfortable, companionable. It was the silence of two people who no longer needed to explain themselves to each other. After the coffee, Elias picked up his axe and headed for the woodpile. It was a familiar, grounding task. The rhythmic thud of the axe was a part of him. A few minutes later, the cabin door opened and Elara came out, a steaming mug in her hand. She walked over and offered it to him. He paused, leaning the axe against the chopping block, and took the mug. Their fingers brushed again, a fleeting, warm contact. He drank the hot, bitter coffee, his eyes never leaving her face. She didn't look away. "They'll be back," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. "I know," he replied, his voice a low rumble. "Silas is not a man who forgives a humiliation. And my father, he lost more than just a daughter yesterday. He lost his authority." She looked around at the small homestead, at the sturdy cabin, the mended fences, the patch of earth where her potatoes were now growing. "This place isn't safe for you anymore, because of me." He finished his coffee and handed the empty mug back to her. He looked at her, then his gaze swept over the horizon, over the land he had bled and sweated for, the land that had been his refuge. He thought of leaving, of packing a few belongings, and disappearing into the mountains, returning to the solitary, ghost-like existence he had known before. The thought held no appeal. It felt like a retreat, a defeat. This place, which had been a symbol of his isolation, had, in the last few weeks, become something else. It had become a home. He looked back at her fierce, resilient spirit. She was not a burden. She was a reason. "This is my land," he said, the words carrying the weight of a solemn vow. "I'm not leaving." Her breath caught in her throat. She searched his face, looking for the truth behind his words. She found no deception, only a deep, unshakable resolve. He was offering her more than just shelter. He was offering her a future. He was offering her a permanent place by his side. He gestured with his head toward the porch, where a single hand-carved rocking chair sat. For years, it had been the only chair. But a few days ago, he had begun working on a second one. It sat beside the first, unfinished but clearly taking shape. It was an unspoken promise, a project he had started without fully understanding why. Now he understood. It was for her. His gesture was an invitation. Stay. build this life with me?" It was not a grand romantic proposal, but it was more honest and more meaningful than any flowery speech. It was a practical offer of partnership, of shared burdens and shared sunrises. A silent contract to stand together against whatever the world threw at them. Elara looked at the unfinished chair on the porch, then back at the man standing before her. His face was a landscape of hardship and resolve, yet in his eyes she saw a steady, unwavering light. It was the promise of safety, of respect. It was everything she had never had. A slow smile, genuine and radiant, spread across her face. Without a word, she turned and walked to the porch, sitting in the old, weathered rocking chair. It felt right. It felt like coming home to a place she had never known existed. Elias watched her for a moment, a rare, almost imperceptible softening around his own mouth. He picked up his axe and resumed his work, the steady rhythm of his chopping a reassuring heartbeat for their new beginning. The day passed in a comfortable, productive rhythm. They worked together, falling into an easy partnership. They repaired a section of fence that had been damaged by Thorn's horses, their hands often close as they worked the wires and posts. They harvested the last of the root vegetables from her small garden, their movements synchronized, a silent dance of shared purpose. In the afternoon, Elias brought the unfinished chair out from the porch and began to work on it again, his knife skillfully carving the wood, his focus absolute. Elara sat nearby, mending one of his shirts, watching his strong, capable hands transform the raw wood into something of comfort and permanence. They were not just building a chair. They were building a life, piece by piece, with quiet determination. As evening fell, they sat together on the porch, watching the sun dip below the jagged peaks of the mountains. The sky was ablaze with color, a fiery testament to the end of a difficult chapter and the dawn of a new one. He had finished the second chair, and now they sat side by side, two solitary figures who had found an unlikely harbor in each other. "Elias," she said, her voice soft in the twilight. It was the first time she had used his name. He turned his head to look at her. "My mother," she began, her gaze distant, "she used to say that a home isn't the roof over your head. It's the people you choose to stand with against the storm." She looked at him, her eyes shining in the fading light. "Thank you for being my home." He didn't answer with words. He simply reached over, his large, rough hand covering hers where it rested on the arm of her chair. His touch was gentle, a silent acknowledgment of her words, a confirmation of the bond they now shared. It was a promise of protection, of partnership, of a shared future. They were a strange, unconventional family, a man scarred by his past and a woman who had refused to be broken by hers. They had been brought together by violence and fear, but they had chosen to stay together out of mutual respect and a deep, unspoken affection. The world outside their small valley was still a dangerous place. Thorn and Croft might return. The coming winter would be harsh. Their life would not be easy. But as they sat together in the quiet twilight, watching the first stars appear in the vast, dark sky, they were not afraid. They had each other. The camera of the mind pulls back, showing the two figures sitting on the porch of the small, sturdy cabin, a single point of warm, golden light against the immense, dark canvas of the untamed wilderness. They are no longer alone. They are a fortress of two, ready to face the dawn together.